This is Noah Wayne, and I'm here with my grandpa, Barry Kranitz, to record his life history as part of the Little Legacies Oral History Project with the Jampel Center for Michigan Jewish Heritage. Today is March 2nd, 2025, and we are here at Temple Beth El in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Grandpa, do we have your permission to record and share this interview?
Absolutely.
When and where were you born?
I was born in the city of Detroit at Hopper Hospital on March 13th, 6:30 in the morning, 1951.
Where did you grow up?
Well, my family lived in Detroit for the first couple of years of my time on Earth. My first actual memory is when I was about 3 years old. We lived in an apartment complex called Blackstone Manor, and it was in the northwest suburbs of Detroit, right on the border of Detroit and the city of Oak Park. And then, right before my 4th birthday, we actually moved to the city of Oak Park, and I lived there for most of my youth and teenage years, with the exception of 3 years between the ages of 8 and 11 years old. My family moved away from Oak Park. My father was trying to improve his business career and took a job opportunity in Saginaw, Michigan. So my family, which consisted of my older sister and my younger sister, my mom and my dad, we moved to Saginaw, and I went to 3rd and 4th grade there, and then we moved to Toledo because my father was transferred there, and then we lived in Toledo for 1 year and then actually moved back to Oak Park.
How and why did your family come to Detroit?
Well, it's kind of a interesting story. My father graduated high school in 1944, and that's during the time of World War II. And he had met my mother in Atlanta, Georgia. My father was from Niagara Falls, New York. But when he enlisted in the Navy, after he graduated, they sent him, after his basic training time, to Atlanta to take radio communications school. And while he was there, he went to a Jewish serviceman's social. And my mother was 16 years old at the time, and she was hosting with other young Jewish women, and her and my father met and continued to stay in touch. And then when the war ended, my father came back to Atlanta because he was smitten with my mom. She was a very charming, pretty young woman, and my father was a very handsome young man, and they fell in love, and they got married in Atlanta. My mother had just turned 17. My father had just turned 19. And when we questioned about how did you get married so young, the standard answer was, well, there was a war on and people did things differently in those times. But anyway, they got married and they lived with my mother's parents, my grandparents, in Atlanta for a couple of years. But my father was born up north, and he really wasn't comfortable in the South in Atlanta. He had a large family back in New York, and they ended up moving back up north to Niagara Falls for a short time. And then my father's older brother had started a business in Detroit, and he felt it was a good opportunity for my father, and he wanted some family also in Detroit with him and his family. So my father and mother and older sister, who was born, had been born before in Atlanta, moved to Detroit. And then a few years later, that's when I came along. And then a little less than 6 years after I was born, my younger sister, Eileen, was also born.
What Jewish traditions did your family have?
Well, we observed and celebrated the Jewish holidays. I was given a traditional, conservative, I guess is how they would characterize it, Jewish education. I went to Sunday school from the time I was 6 years old until I then began Hebrew school when I think I was 8 years old. I went to Hebrew school for 5 years until I was bar mitzvahed, and we observed Shabbos. We sort of kept kosher for most of my childhood, but times were changing. I think my parents kind of got away from some of the more stricter Jewish traditions, and in our home, we kept kosher for most of my childhood, but when we would go out, sometimes we would eat non-kosher foods. But we were growing up at a time of great change, and people were experimenting with different ways of life and things, and that's how I grew up. But I had a bar mitzvah, and I attended a bar mitzvah almost every week, with my friends and family growing up. And I think that's what I have to say about that.
Describe what life looked like when you were my age.
When I was your age, when I was 11, part of the time I was 11, I was living in Toledo, and I played baseball, and I had made friends in Toledo, and playing sports was a large part of my life. When I was a child, I loved all the major sports: football, basketball, baseball. I learned how to ice skate. We played hockey outside. We would freeze over our backyards. And then I moved back starting 6th grade, and I was still 11, to Oak Park, and became friends with basically the same kids that I was friends with before my family had moved out of town for those 3 years. So it was an awakening moving back from places like Saginaw and Toledo back to Oak Park in a larger city and metropolitan area like Detroit, because kids here were a little bit more sophisticated, and I was also becoming aware of, I was transitioning from a child to a teenager, and when I moved back, people were really conscious of the clothes they wear and how they combed their hair, and it was an interesting time for me. Music, was a big thing, but it was a lot of fun. I had a wonderful childhood, a very rich childhood. My family, we had a lot of extended family in the Niagara Falls, Buffalo, New York area, as well as my father's older brother and my cousins that lived in Detroit, and a great uncle that had moved to Detroit. So we spent a lot of time over the holidays and different events like birthdays and anniversaries, being with family. We took frequent trips into Niagara Falls and Buffalo for family events. It was fun.
What Who are your friends and what did you do together?
Well, like I mentioned just a minute ago, my friends are the kids that I first met when I moved to Oak Park when I was 3. And to this day, I'm still friends with probably 8 to 10 people that I went to elementary school with in Oak Park. And Oak Park was a great place to grow up. It had a large Jewish community, and most of my friends were Jewish kids. Some of them came from families that were Holocaust survivors. So I became aware and interested, in what had happened during that time, and we went through a very both exciting and tumultuous time growing up in the late 50s and throughout the 60s. I graduated high school in 1969, so I lived through a lot of momentous events, some good like space exploration, and some very sad like the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. I lived through the civil rights protests and era, a time of great change in this country. And I lived through I was a young man during the Vietnam War protests and the whole countercultural change of the late 60s and early 70s. But it was, to me, life was a big adventure, and I had good friends, and I grew up in just a wonderful environment in growing up in Oak Park.
What were some of the most important events or milestones in your youth?
Well, again, moving away from the first home that I really remembered, which was Oak Park, our home in Oak Park, to Saginaw, Michigan, which was at that time not, at least the area that we moved into Saginaw was a more country type of environment. We had large fields behind our house, and the kids that I met there, we would play all day long in these fields. We could fish, we could climb trees, we could pick wild strawberries and apples from trees. So I had a lot of fun, and that was a change for me from growing up in a big metropolitan area like Detroit to moving out to the country. I got a taste of a different way of life. And then moving back to Detroit area eventually, and having to reacclimate myself to my old friends and what everybody was into here. Wasn't climbing trees and fishing like it was in the Saginaw area, but they were more interested in, meeting girls, learning how to dance. So those were memorable times in my life. But again, like I said, there were things that were going on in the outside world that impacted on my life, like the assassinations and the different protest movements, as well as the things that were going on inside my own circle of family and friends that impacted me.
You're doing very well, actually, within 5 minutes. So you got 3 minutes, total 5 minutes.
How did you meet my grandma?
Well, we both grew up in Oak Park. I knew who she was, but we We didn't really meet until we were about 16 years old in high school. I had seen her at the Oak Park as a kid. One of my other friends said, that girl, that's Barbara Schlussel. She's really a fine girl. And I took notice, but we went to different elementary schools and different junior high schools. But then in our first year in high school, in 10th grade, we were in the same homeroom. So we kind of got to know each other. But we really didn't hang around too much. We kind of ran in different circles of friends. And then in our senior year, we were at a party of a mutual friend at the same time, and we started talking, and she gave me her phone number that night, and I started calling her. And it was getting towards the end of the school year, and we had a senior prom, and I invited her to the prom. And that's how we met, and that's how we began our relationship.
What inspired you to write the children's book, My Grandpa Said?
Well, it's partly you and your brother and your mom and your uncle, Jeff, my son. When your mom and Jeff were young, I used to make up little fanciful tales about different places and things, and we would be somewhere and they would ask a question about the area, and sometimes I would be serious and tell them the actual facts about the place. Other times I'd just make up fairy tales. And then I found myself doing that with you and Theo later on. And one time, I think you were at Camp Tamarack, and your parents were celebrating their anniversary out of town in Charleston, and Theo was staying with Grandma and me. And him and I went somewhere, and he was asking me questions about the place. I think it was Walled Lake, Michigan, and there was just a lake there and buildings he wasn't familiar with, and I started making up little stories about the place. And when we got back home, he ran inside the house and he said, Grandpa said such and such. And Grandpa said this, and Grandpa said that. Is this true? Is this really? And for some reason, that phrase, my Grandpa said, stuck in my mind. And I went to bed that night thinking about it. And when I woke up in the morning, it was still there. And I just all of a sudden was inspired to write these verses that began with, my grandpa said when I was a boy. And they just kept coming, and I kept writing them down. That's how it happened.
And finally, what words of wisdom do you want to leave for the future?
Words of wisdom. Well, work hard, play hard, have fun, everything in moderation. Don't go to too much of an extreme one way or the other in life. Try and keep balanced, keep your feet on the ground, but have dreams, aspire to great things. You can achieve anything you really put your heart and mind focused on, and you get out of life pretty much what you put into it, I've found. So those are the things that I would try to impart to people that are beginning the journey of life.
Well, thank you for sharing your story with me.
Thank you for asking me these questions and allowing me to share my life with you.